600 million years of primate evolution. Thousands of Yeti sightings across the Himalayas. And when scientists finally tested the bones, hair, and teeth that believers called their strongest evidence, 8 of 9 samples belonged to the same animal. But it was not an ape, and the species they found had been hiding a 650,000-year-old secret that nobody expected. On November 8, 1951, British mountaineer Eric Shipton was descending a glacier in the Menlung Basin during the Everest reconnaissance expedition. He was at roughly 16,000 feet, somewhere on the border between Nepal and Tibet, when he and his climbing partner Michael Ward stumbled across a line of enormous footprints in the snow. Shipton had no measuring tape, so he placed his ice axe next to the clearest print and took a photograph. The footprint measured 13 inches from heel to toe, nearly twice the width of Ward's climbing boot, with distinct toe imprints and claw marks where the trail crossed narrow crevasses. Sherpa Sen Tenzing, who was traveling with them, identified the tracks immediately. He called them Yeti. The team followed the prints for about a mile down the glacier before they had to make camp. The photographs were published in the Times of London on December 7, 1951, and within weeks, the abominable snowman was front-page news across the Western world. That single photograph launched decades of expeditions, documentaries, and obsession. Edmund Hillary, who was part of Shipton's expedition team, would later lead his own Yeti hunting mission. But for 60 years, nobody tested the actual physical evidence. Hair from monastery relics, bones from Tibetan caves, teeth sold in markets, droppings collected on remote trails. The samples sat in museums and private collections, waiting. Then in 2012, an Oxford genetics professor named Bryan Sykes put out an open call to the world. Send me your Yeti hair. Send me your Bigfoot samples. Anything you believe came from an anomalous primate. 57 samples arrived from believers, museums, and collectors across multiple continents. After microscopic screening, 30 went through mitochondrial DNA sequencing. The results landed in 2014 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. B. 28 of the 30 samples matched known animals: bears, horses, cows, dogs, a porcupine, a raccoon, and 1 human. But 2 Himalayan samples told a different story. One came from a hunter in Ladakh, India, who had shot an animal roughly 40 years earlier and said its behavior was completely unlike any brown bear he had encountered. The other came from a bamboo forest in Bhutan at 3,500 meters elevation, identified locally as the nest of a Migihur, the Bhutanese name for the Yeti. Both samples returned a 100% match to DNA from a 40,000-year-old Paleolithic polar bear fossil. Sykes proposed that a previously unknown bear, possibly a polar bear and brown bear hybrid, might still be roaming the Himalayas. The headlines went everywhere. However, the polar bear theory barely survived a year. Ross Barnett and Kiridwan Edwards, researchers at the Natural History Museum of Denmark and Oxford, published a direct rebuttal in the same journal. They zeroed in on the single nucleotide that separated brown bears from polar bears in the segment that Sykes had analyzed. That mutation sat at position 1751, right in the middle of a run of 6 cytosine bases, and in ancient DNA science, that is the exact spot where degradation happens most frequently. Cytosine breaks down into uracil over time, creating a false C to T substitution. The polar bear signal was almost certainly an artifact of damage, not evidence of a cryptid. Gutierrez and Pine confirmed this in 2015. They showed that brown bear and polar bear DNA sequences in the 12S RNA gene overlap enough that a 104 base pair fragment, the tiny window Sykes had analyzed, simply could not tell them apart. The most likely explanation was the simplest one. Both samples came from Himalayan brown bears, known locally as Zute, a name that has been linked to Yeti folklore for generations. Charlotte Lindqvist decided to settle the question permanently. An evolutionary biologist at the University at Buffalo, she gathered 9 specimens that represented the strongest physical evidence believers had for the Yeti. A femur bone from a cave on the Tibetan plateau said to be from a Yeti corpse. A skin sample from a monastery relic described as a Yeti paw. Hair that a Jesuit priest reportedly obtained after a Yeti sighting in the 1950s. Teeth, feces, skin fragments. She sequenced complete mitochondrial DNA, not just a short fragment. The results were published in 2017, again in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. B. 8 of 9 samples were bears. 1 Asian black bear, 1 Himalayan brown bear, 6 Tibetan brown bears. The 9th was a dog. Not a single sample returned primate DNA of any kind. The study was described as the most rigorous analysis to date of samples suspected to come from anomalous or mythical hominid-like creatures. That should have been the end of the story. But Lindqvist found something that turned the entire project on its head. By sequencing the full mitochondrial genomes of 23 Asian bears, including the supposed Yeti specimens, Lindqvist discovered that Himalayan brown bears belong to a separate evolutionary lineage from every other brown bear population on Earth. They split from the global brown bear family approximately 650,000 years ago, during a massive glaciation event that sent ice walls across the high Himalayas. Those glaciers cut off the Himalayan bears from their relatives, and they evolved in isolation ever since. Tibetan brown bears, by contrast, remain genetically connected to brown bears in North America and Eurasia. The two populations live in the same mountain system. They look similar, but genetically they are profoundly different. And nobody knew this until Yeti hunters accidentally delivered the samples that made the discovery possible. Lindqvist's work also produced the first complete mitochondrial genomes for both the Himalayan brown bear and the Himalayan black bear. Before her study, almost no usable genetic data existed for either subspecies. The Yeti investigation had stumbled into conservation genetics by accident. If this is changing how you think about cryptozoology, hit subscribe. I break down the real science behind the world's biggest mysteries every week. Now, let's talk about the theory that refuses to die. The most persistent alternative explanation for the Yeti has always been Gigantopithecus blacki, the largest primate that ever existed. Standing an estimated 9 to 10 feet tall and weighing between 600 and 1,200 pounds. This giant ape roamed southern China from about 2 million years ago until its extinction. In the 1950s, anthropologists like Grover Krantz proposed that surviving populations could explain Yeti and Bigfoot sightings worldwide. The problem is that every line of evidence now runs against the theory. A 2024 Nature study dated the extinction of Gigantopithecus to between 295,000 and 215,000 years ago, using 157 radiometric dates from 22 caves. A 2019 protein analysis of a 1.9 million-year-old tooth confirmed that Gigantopithecus was a pongene, an early diverging relative of orangutans that split from their lineage 10 to 12 million years ago. Its fossils are exclusively from southern China and Vietnam. No remains have ever been found after the Middle Pleistocene. And across every DNA study of alleged Yeti material, not one sample has returned primate DNA. The giant ape explanation is elegant. It is also completely unsupported. Reinhold Messner reached the same conclusion 19 years before Lindqvist's DNA results. In 1986, the greatest mountaineer alive, the first person to climb Everest without supplemental oxygen, was climbing solo in eastern Tibet when he encountered an upright, hair-covered creature at roughly 30 feet. It stood over 7 feet tall with arms hanging nearly to its knees, and it moved with startling speed. Messner spent the next 11 years returning to Tibet, Nepal, and Bhutan. He trekked through remote monasteries and sat with nomadic herders who lived above the tree line. He interviewed monks, farmers, and Sherpa communities across 3 countries. They all described the same animal. They called it the chemo or dremo, an omnivore that could stand upright and snap a goat's spine in 2. In his 1998 book, My Quest for the Yeti, Messner concluded it was a rare nocturnal form of brown bear. The scientific community mostly ignored him. The DNA would prove him right 2 decades later. Here is the part of this story that should keep you up at night. The Himalayan brown bear, the animal behind centuries of Yeti sightings, is itself disappearing. Populations are small, fragmented, and critically endangered across Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Tibet. Before Lindqvist's 2017 study, conservation biologists had almost no genetic data to work with. Her mitochondrial genomes now provide the baseline for population estimates, genetic diversity assessments, and management strategies. We spent decades and millions of dollars chasing a monster. The monster turned out to be a bear, and now that bear needs saving. Deforestation, habitat fragmentation, and climate change are shrinking the alpine meadows and forests these animals depend on. Conservation programs at places like Deosai National Park in Pakistan, one of the highest plateaus in the world at over 4,000 meters elevation, represent some of the only active efforts to protect them. The Snow Leopard Trust in Pakistan contributed samples to Lindqvist's research, bridging the gap between cryptozoology and conservation biology. The Yeti legend has roots stretching back at least 350 years in Sherpa culture, to a holy man named Sangwa Dorje, who settled near the village of Pangboche with a clear view of Everest. Local traditions say he was aided by Yetis and kept their relics. The Western term abominable snowman came from a mistranslation in the 1920s. Messner traced references to similar creatures all the way back to 326 BCE and Alexander the Great. And there is a physical reason the myth keeps rebuilding itself. Sun and wind in the Himalayas can double or triple a footprint size within hours. A langur monkey track at dawn looks like a giant ape print by afternoon. A bear walking through snow places its hind paws in the prints of its front paws, creating a single line of tracks that looks bipedal. Every Yeti sample ever tested has returned a known animal. But as evolutionary biologist Ross Barnett put it after the Lindqvist study, you cannot debunk a myth with anything as mundane as facts. As long as bears leave melting footprints in the snow and travelers return from the high Himalayas with stories they cannot quite explain, there will be stories of Yetis. The DNA answered the question. The Yeti, as a hidden primate, does not exist, but the search for it accidentally uncovered a 650,000-year evolutionary secret and delivered the first genetic tools to protect one of the most endangered bears on Earth. Sometimes the real discovery is the one you were never looking for.